Thank you. All right, so let me just share the screen over here. Yeah, so my project is basically looking at the teaching of multiple languages in Norway and Russia, specifically looking at the teachers' beliefs in classroom practices. This particular project, like what I'll be discussing with you today, is focusing only on the practices. So before I start with this, just want to give you a very quick background about myself. I'm, yeah, I could actually turn this away because, so yeah, I'm researching multilingual teachers at the University of Bergen. I have taught English, French, Persian, and Arabic previously, and I also know Russian and Norwegian, and this will make sense in a bit because it's part of my project. I'm also part of the Multilingualism on My Mind research group at UIB, where we're just a bunch of researchers that are very interested in multilingualism in all its forms. Why am I doing this study on multilingual teachers? One of the things that I think all of you have been noticing is that cities are becoming increasingly super diverse, and that has had an effect on the classrooms as well. So you have an increasing number of students who speak multiple languages, multicultural. So it's not like it was before. However, in many instances, you still have languages that are being taught monolingually. So we still have these assumptions that everybody just speaks one language and we all share the same L1. It's not always the case, but it happens quite often, and this needs to change a little bit. You also have a lot of countries like Russia, like Norway, many of the Gulf states, places like in Singapore, where there's a special emphasis on developing multilingual citizens. It's important for people to speak multiple languages and be able to do so efficiently and quickly. And of course, the world is also changing. It's becoming more multipolar. English might no longer be enough. So there are a number of reasons to study multilingualism, especially teacher multilingualism. And so this led basically me to ask a couple of questions in research. And so since you have all these countries that are placing so much emphasis on multilingualism, on developing multilingual citizens, what are the teachers doing? So you have curriculums that are stressing the need to learn multiple languages. You have places like the UAE and Norway and Russia where you can learn 2 foreign languages at school, at one after the other and concurrently. And so when you look at the research, you don't really find a lot of, you don't find so many studies on specific multilingual practices. You might have a few intervention studies, but most of them are basically on beliefs. You also don't really have a lot of stuff on languages other than English. For example, what's happening with like French, Spanish, Chinese? Is there a specific influence based on the teaching context? Somebody teaching in Norway versus somebody teaching in Russia versus somebody teaching in the Emirates, are they teaching differently? Is there an actual difference because of the language curriculum? And what about teachers who are teaching more than one language? This is actually becoming quite common, where you have teachers who are teaching English and French, or German and Spanish together, or English and Chinese. How are these people? How do they approach their different languages? Do they teach differently based on the language, and why might they be teaching differently? And it's important to analyze these trends on a large scale to see, like, are these like countrywide? Is it something that's like a general feature of teachers, or is it something that's unique? So when I talk about multilingual practices, when I talk about the project, I won't be showing you all the items. It's a questionnaire, but what I mean by multilingual practices could be translanguaging. It could be awakening to languages, where you just make people aware of all the different languages that are out there. You can talk about cross-linguistic comparisons, where it's like cognates, or you can take a look at how verb tenses, like Germanic languages, English, German in the past tense, etc., and also translation. Why engage in such practices? Because you already have a tool set that you can rely on to learn additional languages, and you can learn them quite quickly. The traditional method is to sort of isolate and learn everything in isolation, where you should not use other languages because for some reason they might, mess with learning additional languages or something. But in any case, so the project is actually ongoing. I'm just going to talk about the first phase, which is, well, this is an article that's been hopefully published, will be published soon. But anyways, it's from the questionnaire part. which was actually validated quite comprehensively. I won't get into that because I don't have that much time. But in any case, so it was 517 language teachers from secondary schools in Norway and Russia. The reason to take secondary schools was because, again, that's at this point, students are learning two languages, foreign languages in general. So I just wanted to, see about those teachers who teach two languages rather than just one. And so I found out of the 517, there were 115 teachers that were teaching two foreign languages at the same time, which means they were responsible for two foreign languages, and 13 that were teaching three. So that's actually really not been done before to such an extent as when you take a look at language teachers that are teaching three foreign languages at the same time at school. Why did I choose Norway and Russia? Well, access, logistics, and also because you really have almost nothing on Russia in terms of multilingual teaching. When it's acquired multilingualism, acquired foreign languages, you don't have anything. You do have like stuff on minority languages. Same thing with Norway. I mean, generally all over the place, but Norway and Russia, they're neighbors. It's kind of interesting. And so the language teachers that I surveyed, they were generally teaching four languages, so, or a combination of them. So it's English, French, German, and Spanish. I also found teachers who were teaching Chinese and Italian, but they were excluded from the study, well, from this part of the study because there were too few of them, like there were like 5 or 6 of them in total. And so I specifically explored practices and their proficiency. In terms of beliefs, this was already done previously. I've done that before, and generally, you will always find teachers with positive beliefs about multilingualism. You will generally not find, perhaps in a minority, you'll find teachers who are opposed to multilingualism. Generally, beliefs are always positive, but they seldom correlate with practices. Like there's either no correlation or it's a weak correlation. So I decided to, for this part, just leave that out because I've already done that. So in terms of the results, what did I find? So there were, I'm going to try to see if I can this a little bit lower. Yeah, so what I found was in terms of multilingual practices, and what I mean by that is translanguaging, when you sort of, use the other languages that you know and your students know, that there were certain differences that were not context specific. So it didn't matter whether they were teaching in Russia or in Norway, they were doing the same stuff. And what I found was that German and Spanish were taught, well, in general, as you can see, the scale over here goes from like never to every lesson, which is 6. So it was a 6-point Likert scale. And over here, what you can see is they generally don't use it that much, but that there were statistically significant differences between how they were teaching German and Spanish versus English, which was taught the least multilingually, you can say, and also French, which was also kind of, not taught that multilingually. And so, again, I didn't find any differences in terms of context. There were no differences between Norwegian and Russian teachers. There were, however, differences between teachers who were teaching 1 foreign languages versus those teaching 2, and then those teaching 3. And the differences were quite stark when you compare those teaching only 1 foreign language with those teaching 2. And you can see that, for example, when you look at the German teachers, for example, over here, these were like statistically, these are like pretty significant differences over here. When it came to German and Spanish, not so much when it came to English and French. In fact, it kind of goes down a little bit over here too. But then there are very few of them over here. There are like, I guess, 13 that were doing this. So the results are not, I don't know, might not be very conclusive for this group over here. So there were these rather interesting differences. And I also took a look at like how they report their proficiency in the languages. So again, these are all 6-point Likert scales. And what I saw was, again, it was kind of decent for English, low for French, and quite high for both German and Spanish. Yeah, I'll get back to that, why this might be quite an interesting thing to explore and an interesting area. But what else? I also found that, for example, you had several teachers with combinations. So they were teaching 2 languages or more. And every single teacher that taught French with another language, there were no differences in their practices, which was kind of strange. But all other combinations, you had like variations. For example, if you had like Spanish or English, or German or English and Spanish, there were significant differences over there. No differences when French was involved. And what I also found was that proficiency correlated with their practices, like how frequently they use them. For example, it was not only like, for example, if they had a high proficiency in French, that they engaged more in multilingual practices. They did that, but there were also like cross language correlations. For example, if they had a high proficiency in French and they were teaching German, that was a strong and significant correlation. So it was like your proficiency in one language was actually helping you engage in multilingual practices in the other languages as well. So it was like a cross language benefit. And there were also a couple of open-ended questions that asked teachers about whether they had initiated or their schools had initiated any programs or any sort of activities that promoted multilingualism and language awareness at their schools. And the responses were that it almost never happened, or it was very, very rare, or it was mostly during like one day out of the entire year. So they reported very, very low levels of promoting multilingualism and language awareness, even though the governments and their curriculums actually stress the need to develop multilingual individuals. And so some of the implications of the study, I'm sorry that I'm rushing through this, but I don't have that much time. I think one of the things of the study is that there needs to be a greater focus on proficiency, on teacher proficiency when you're researching multilingualism. Right now, the focus is more on their beliefs in promoting like multiculturalism and tolerance. That's all great. It's important to have strong positive beliefs about the benefits of multilingualism, but I think that these initiatives will not be very effective if they don't strongly focus on developing their proficiency. I think proficiency is key, at least based on the findings from this study. Is like if you don't focus on their proficiency just by making them, giving them happy thoughts about multilingualism, you're not going to really realize something concrete in the classroom with respect to them or their students. We also need more studies on those teaching 2 or more foreign languages, especially with this thing with French. French is taught quite differently from Spanish and German. I understand the thing about English being taught maybe less multilingually because it's seen as more like a lingua franca, and you've got that communicative approach over there that might be influencing some teachers, but that still doesn't make I still don't understand why French was being taught differently than Spanish and German. They're all foreign languages, both in Norway and Russia. So that's something that I will be exploring more in detail later. Another thing that sort of was interesting was that I thought that there would be a difference between Norway and Russia in terms of context, that Russian teachers and Norwegian teachers would be teaching stuff differently, and it turned out that they weren't really teaching anything differently, except for maybe Spanish, where Norwegian teachers were teaching it a little bit more multilingually. But generally, the context does not seem to influence how frequently they use things like translanguaging and other multilingual practices in the classroom. So that's also, I guess, quite interesting. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully I didn't take too much time.
Thank you, Raees. No, you didn't take too much time at all. In fact, you're inside your time at the moment. And at the moment, we don't have any new questions in the Q&A stream. So if I could give people a little while to think about what their questions might be for Raees' very interesting talk there. And I'll ask you a question to get things going. So I'm really interested in multilingual practices myself. And I am wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what you mean by multilingual practices within the context of your study.
So multilingual practices are basically those that you are, traditionally you would just teach the language through the language. So for example, in an English lesson, you're basically just using English. Multilingual practices means you draw on other languages. You draw on the languages that you and your students know, the other languages. Normally what happens is that, let's say if the teacher's a non-native speaker, you will both have a shared L1. Let's say somebody in China is learning English, teacher's also Chinese. You don't just use English, you can use Chinese. But in more multilingual, super diverse contexts, let's say the teacher is from some other country, or let's say at school, the students are learning English and French, let's say in Japan. So the teacher can use their knowledge of, for example, not only Japanese, which is their L1, but also, for example, French. This could be done through, like I said, you can do cross-linguistic comparisons. For example, French and English are similar in that they have a lot of Latin words. There are certain grammatical features that are there in French that are not there in Japanese, and you can sort of help your students achieve a better idea of how languages are put together, certain language groups, and you can also give them the tools to maybe predict certain things, proactively learn a language and not be sort of, confused or have difficulties. And you can give them a set of strategies using these things. When I talk about translanguaging, I mean the same thing. It needs to be conscious. It's not like something that you have when you do, a conversation with your friends, but it's like it's conscious. It's like grammar. You target certain like prepositions or grammar, etc. So that's what I mean by multilingual
Great.
pedagogy.
Okay, so we're talking pretty much about a translanguaging pedagogy, and we're talking specifically also in terms of teaching a foreign language. So, for example, children in Norway learning French or German, as opposed to the sort of pedagogy that we might have in a multi-diverse, multilinguistic classroom that's about, something else. Okay, lovely. Thanks for that clarity. Okay, so we've got some questions come in now. We've got one from Dinah or Dina. Apologies for any mispronunciations again. And we're asking, hang on, were measures of proficiency all by self-report?
So it was self-reported, yeah. I mean, the other thing is that because of this situation with you can't really observe them, and I decided not to test them because, again, I think that tests can be don't really give you an idea of their overall proficiency. So these were self-reported. I decided to trust the teachers to see how they sort of rated their proficiency, but it was self-reported, yeah.
Okay, great. And as a follow-up, she asks, were these only multilingual incidents by the teacher, or were student-initiated multilingual uses also included?
So the items that I had in the questionnaire, they were quite general, but they were, I would say that they were both teacher and student initiated. So they were more interactive, but there was a specific focus on the activities that teachers can do with students. So these were not necessarily looking at maybe just like normal interactions, maybe between activities per se, but these were like I wanted to see a conscious effort on the part of teachers to actually implement a multilingual pedagogy, and not so much that just random interactions that might happen between, students and teachers, but actually like learning, like a teaching moments that are, a conscious effort on the part of teachers. So it was more,
more teacher-oriented. Lovely. Elena asks, is there any correlation between the teacher's own background and the frequency of their multilingual practices?
So no, I even took a look at their out-of-school practices regarding to language, because a lot of people just take a look at what they do in school, but I also took a look at what they do outside of school with the languages. There were no significant differences. Most of the teachers were either like, I would say ethnic, well, they were like Norwegian citizens or they were Russian citizens. There were a handful of international teachers, but their populations were too small to be of any to have like a significant effect on any of the results as such. So they were mostly like, and I also took a look at different regions of Russia and Norway. So for example, I took a look at like southern Norway and western Norway and eastern Norway, and even with Russia, I had people all the way in Siberia. And I found that there were no differences based on county or province either. So so in terms of where they were teaching, where they were from in Norway or Russia, how often they use languages outside of their language habits outside of the school, none of that, or their ethnicity or like nationality, or let's say that they're L1, whether it was Norwegian, Russian, or something else, it didn't have an effect on their practices.
That's really interesting. Okay, here's another one from Robert. He says, do you know what the teachers use the different languages for, apart from the obvious choice, i.e. vocabulary? So were there things beyond vocabulary for which they were employing a translanguaging pedagogy, in other words?
Yeah, so the items focused on not just vocab, they focused on like combining, for example, you combine a reading in one language and then like say writing in another, or you listen to something and you speak, you like listen to something in one language and you write and you it's like receptive and productive activities in different languages, grammar, cognates, it's not just vocab, but also like morphosyntax. So there were a couple of things that focused on like language structure, on language abilities. It was quite comprehensive, and it sort of encompassed pretty much the entire range of what you can do with the multilingual pedagogy, like with multilingual practices. Like it's like even like awakening to languages, just like using different languages, introducing languages that the other students speak in class, like getting people, you know, more aware of all the different languages and how they're all put together out there. So there were a couple of, there were a couple of
No
different
worries.
activities over there, in addition to vocab.
Okay, thank you. And here's one from Beatrice, and she says, thanks, Raees. As a curiosity, where were the schools located? Big cities, villages, both?
Yeah,
And did you?
both.
And,
So, for example, in Norway, I took a look at Oslo and Bergen. These are like the two of the, well, Bergen might be the third or the second, but yeah, I took a look at big cities and also counties. So what they have in Norway is that you can, when I was looking for teachers, they actually have county websites, and the counties basically, they consist of big cities and also small villages. So it was a good, I think it was a good combination of big and small cities / villages. I'm not sure if you still have villages in that traditional sense, but maybe they might be out there.
okay. And she also asks, did you have a chance to compare if there was an influence on location, i.e. urban versus rural?
Yeah, I did, and there was absolutely, there were surprisingly no differences. This was actually something that I was looking for in the Russian context. I thought that, for example, you know, people teaching in Moscow, which is much more super diverse, versus somebody teaching somewhere in Siberia, where it's much more, I mean, it's much more like homogenous. I thought that there would be a difference, but I didn't find any inside, within, or between Norway and Russia, which was a little surprising.
Okay. Yeah. That is interesting, isn't it? So we've got several people asking here. We've got a question from Pui and a question from Oana asking, are you planning a follow-up study at all?
I am, yeah.
What are your next steps?
Well, I'm definitely planning to explore this further. And right now I'm trying to figure out how to do this, especially with the way things are, the situation. But I am trying to put together, I mean, I am conducting interviews. I wanted to do case studies and observations as well, but now with, I just don't know how I'm going to proceed with that. But yeah, I'll definitely be exploring this further. And I kind of did sort of discuss that and the implications a little bit. I'll be exploring some of these things more deeply, for sure.
Okay. There's a question here, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this. This is from Georgia. What do you think about the different forms of Norwegian language on its own?
I think, so with Norwegian, you've got two different written forms officially. You've got Bokmål and Nynorsk, which is like the new Norwegian thing. In terms of dialects, you've got actually quite a few different dialects. I mean, there are more than two. There's several dialects. What do I think about that? Is it multilingual? It certainly is a type of multilingualism, but then I think you have different degrees of it, right? For example, if you have somebody who's speaking different dialects of Norwegian versus somebody who's speaking Norwegian and Chinese, that's a different, I mean, you're talking about a different type of activation in your brain, and the way you look at languages, of course, will be much, much more different, which is why I also wanted to include more teachers of Chinese. I just couldn't get as many of them, and all of them from Russia, because you don't really have Chinese being taught in Norway at the school level that much, but in Russia it's become a really big thing. And to sort of see how, because Spanish, German, all of these are European languages, and they generally follow a European structure, but explore those who are doing something like Chinese, which is really, really very different, is something that I want to pursue further later on, is like in terms of cognitive and metacognitive, like how does that person, you know, move between those languages and approach that, and does that person have like interesting insights or like strategies that they use, or have they like noticed something that other people haven't? It's something that I want to do in the future. So I think there are different levels of multilingualism. Yes, the Norwegian, you know, dialects, that's one level, but I think that there are, you know, other levels that need to be explored in greater detail.
Thank you. So we have another couple of participants out of our 245, by the way, watching us, who want to know a little bit more about the pedagogy of itself and why it's advantageous. So Hui Jin says, I'm rather interested in understanding why multilingual teaching of a language is considered as advantageous, as there are schools of thought in multilingual cities such as the one I'm in, where full immersion of the target language is thought of as a more efficient way of learning the language. What's your thoughts about that?
It's like, the full immersion thing is like, it treats you like a baby, right? It's like, treats you like an infant who is like, it's the native natural approach where I'm just going to throw one thing at you and you're going to get it. But you're no longer a child. you're smarter, you have all these tools and experiences that you've gathered as a person, right? So you've learned other languages, and hopefully you've learned them explicitly, where it's like, you know how to identify different language structures. You've also hopefully picked up a number of learning strategies. If you haven't, then that's the fault of your teachers probably. But you've got this huge amount of information and strategies and experiences, and the immersion approach basically throws all of that out the door. It's just like, it sort of assumes that you're starting from scratch when you're not. I'm not saying that a multilingual strategy is something that we must always go for, but right now we need better alternatives, especially because in a lot of places this immersion approach is not working. In Norway and in other places, you've got people who've been learning English and stuff for 8-9 years immersively, and it doesn't seem to work. They still, they not only do they not learn the language that well in certain ways, like at advanced levels, but they also then don't have the tools or experiences or strategies that they can use to learn additional languages, which means when you learn something immersively, you don't really know how you learned it. You're not really given those strategies. And so when you go on to learn other languages, you start from scratch all the time. Like every new language you start from zero. And multilingual stuff actually helps you connect languages, because languages are connected. If you can see the differences and the similarities, that's going to actually help you, because you can't really do academic writing intuitively. Intuition only helps you to a certain point. You're not going to be able to do advanced, like academic and speaking in a very advanced, like in like academic context, or when you're 30 and 40, you don't want to speak like you're 12. So learning something immersively only helps to a certain point. You're going to need multilingual, more metalinguistic, sort of more explicit instruction to go forward. And that's not only for non-natives, it's also for native speakers. That's why we also learn, well, in good schools, you're going to be taught, aspects of language, not naturally, but actually, metalingual, like explicitly.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Tracy. We've just got one more before we need to wrap up. Lots of questions came in, which is great. And Esther asks, first she starts by thanking you. Very relevant talk indeed. I'm interested in the type of questions that were included in your study. Can we look them up somewhere?
Yeah, so that's hopefully going to be published soon. The entire questionnaire will be out hopefully in a week or two, fingers crossed. But yeah, I mean, I didn't put the questionnaire up over here because it's pretty big. It's like pretty comprehensive like that, but it'll be out soon, and then I'm sure you guys can find it, or I can send it. I don't know, or I can just, I'm sure you'll find it, because there are not so many of them out there right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Raees. And again, let's imagine the sound of tumultuous clapping from the 246 people who are here watching you. Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk.
Yeah, thank you.